To soften the Confederate defenses and shield his troops from view, a massive artillery bombardment will be initiated prior to the attack. On May the 22nd, early in the morning, General Grant joins McPherson on that knoll directly behind us. From that vantage point, he will have a clear, unobstructed view of his entire attacking front, all the way from the stockade Redan here on the north, about a mile north of us, past this point down to the vicinity of the railroad redoubt and Fort Garrett, 1.5 to 2 miles south of here. At 6 o'clock in the morning, more than 200 Union artillery pieces opened fire, and for 4 hours they will pummel the works with solid shot and shell. Again, the thick smoke of the guns completely shrouds the field, making it impossible to see. After 4 hours of bombardment, or during the course of the bombardment, McPherson is forming his men in this column formation. The head of the column is down here in this now densely wooded ravine and continues all the way for almost a mile behind us here. But at 10 o'clock, the guns fall silent, which is the signal for the infantry to advance. With a mighty cheer, the Federal column pours out of this ravine and surges down the Jackson Road. Under the concealing smoke from this artillery barrage, they begin to enter that road cut you see just beyond the Illinois Monument. But by the time they enter this cut, the smoke from the artillery barrage begins to dissipate and rise, exposing the fields for all to see. Thus, by the time the head of the column emerges from that cut, now only 125 yards from the Confederate defense line, the Confederates rise en masse, peer over their parapets, catch sight of the Federal column, and open fire. Scores of men from the lead regiment are killed or wounded. The bodies of the dead and wounded begin to pile up there at the road cut. As a result, the head of the column stalls. With the head of the column stalled, the rear of the column can go no farther, and it's quite clear to Grant and McPherson from their vantage point that less than 15 minutes after this attack has been launched, that it has been checked and bloodily repulsed. Grant, however, is not yet willing to throw in the towel. He scans with his binoculars his entire attacking front and can see that elsewhere the Feds aren't having much success. But before he will throw in the towel and call his troops back, he wants to confer with General Sherman, his most trusted subordinate officer. So he leaves this area and heads to the north. No sooner does he leave this area than a courier suddenly comes riding up from the south with a note from General McClernand, and that courier is directed north to the Graveyard Road. By the time Grant gets to the Graveyard Road, Sherman's attack as well has been stalled. Grant dismounts and asks Sherman how things were going on his front, and without muttering a word, Uncle Billy just pointed to the front, and Grant got a pretty clear idea that this attack has failed. He was on the verge of calling back his troops to minimize his casualties when up rides this courier with a note from McClernand that reads in part, "I'm in possession of 2 Confederate forts over which the stars and stripes are gloriously flying," and he asks that the attacks be renewed. Grant doubts the veracity of this note, but if his subordinate on the field of battle states he's in possession of 2 forts and asks that the attack be renewed, he has no recourse but to renew the attacks. And so all along this broad 3-mile front in the afternoon of May the 22nd, the Union troops surged forward once again. Here along the Jackson Road, again in column formation, the men of the 17th Army Corps will race down this road and into the road cut before you. Several regiments will make it out of the cut. They'll make it to the point of the 3rd Louisiana Redan. But the 3rd Louisiana Redan is the only one of these major Confederate forts that does not have a ditch, or a dry moat, if you will, in front of it. The walls of 3rd Louisiana Redan are 26 feet thick, 18 feet high. Without scaling ladders in hand, the Federals cannot go over the top. Their attack is blunted against the point of the Redan, and they are checked and driven back once more. And so by day's end, all along this broad 3-mile front, the Union forces are bloodily repulsed and driven back. Grant's losses on May the 22nd exceed 3,000 soldiers. His nose bloodied twice, Grant decides to examine his options. But Grant is still contemplating yet another attack against Vicksburg. Not willing to concede defeat, He leaves behind his dead and his wounded. As one Confederate soldier wrote, as we peered over our parapets, we could see the bodies of the dead and wounded. In places they covered the ground as neatly as if by a blanket of blue. The dead lay in heaps upon the ground in every conceivable posture, and there they lay for days, exposed to the sun, to the rain, to the heat, to the flies. He said the stench was sickening. Another Confederate soldier wrote that the Yanks are trying to stink us out of Vicksburg. Finally, on the 25th day of May, white flags appear along the Confederate line. Many Union soldiers are hopeful that Pemberton is about to surrender, but a courier rides out from the city with a note to General Grant imploring in the name of humanity that he bury his dead, for the odor had become quite offensive. Grant finally relents and acquiesces. He calls for a flag of truce for 2½ hours to remove his wounded and bury his dead. And so at 6 o'clock in the afternoon of May the 25th, white flags appear all along this line, and pouring out from their works were men in blue and gray who mingled between the lines. One soldier recalled, over there a group of 4 played cards, 2 Yanks and 2 Rebs, while others swapped tobacco for coffee. And while the gruesome task of the burial details went about, it was almost as if there were no war in progress. But at the appointed time, the flags were taken down and everyone ran for cover. The siege of Vicksburg began in earnest that day. We're going to talk about siege operations now. Now, what are siege operations? In siege operations, the typical mode of operation is to extend your lines to the left and to the right until they completely encircle those of your enemy. Cut him off from all supply and communications with the outside world, force him to subsist solely on what they had stockpiled in the city prior to the siege. And of course, with each and every passing day, those supplies would dwindle, and thus it becomes a war of attrition. Simply, as Grant termed it, out-camp the enemy. And so Grant decided to out-camp his enemy. But even during siege operations, once you extend your lines and form this line of circumvallation around the city of Vicksburg, you're not stationary and static. Rather, the Union Army, once they completed their lines of encirclement, would begin constructing approaches, as they were called, or saps, as they were also called, toward the Confederate line. The idea is to excavate these saps in a zigzag fashion, back and forth, then form a parallel. Move up your infantry, move up your artillery, form another forward sap or approach, a second parallel, move up your infantry, move up your artillery, first to within 300 yards, then 200 yards, then 100 yards, and still the digging would continue. The idea is to get as close to the enemy as possible, wherefore if an attack is ordered, all you need do is pour out of your trench over the common parapet of earth and log that you would share with the enemy and into the enemy forces, minimizing your casualties, maximizing your troop strength, hopefully overwhelm the enemy and gain access to Vicksburg. Or if you don't wish to assault the works in that fashion, once you get up to them, you can tunnel underneath them, hollow out rooms, fill them with black powder, blow the fort sky high, surge into the breach created by the explosion, and gain access to Vicksburg. That is what the Union Army would attempt to do during the siege of Vicksburg. And so all along this broad front, the Federal forces working under the command of engineering officers would excavate 13 different approaches aimed at various strong points along the Confederate defense perimeter. Of these 13 approaches, without question the most successful was that known as Logan's approach, and named in honor of General John Logan, Blackjack, whose statue we saw behind us just a few moments ago. Rob, if I may have those, please.
What about the river? The river must be closed down for getting supplies in and everything.
The river itself, and here you see a map of the river. Not only do you have Porter's gunboats that had run by the batteries of Vicksburg and ferried Grant's army across the river, moored here south of town, you also have a good portion of the Union fleet that did not participate in the passage of the batteries, moored north of town. And so the river is cut off. If I may follow that train of thought just a moment, in case I forget to do so later on, during the course of the siege of Vicksburg, Confederate forces in the Trans-Mississippi Department, that's that vast department on the other side of the river, would attempt to come to Vicksburg's relief. They were hoping to create a diversion in Pemberton's favor, enabling the garrison of Vicksburg to cut their way out. These forces are under the command of General Richard Taylor, the son of former President Zachary Taylor. On June the 7th of 1863, they would attack Union supply enclaves in Louisiana at Milliken's Bend, Young's Point, and at Goodrich's Landing. The idea was to destroy Grant's supply enclaves in Louisiana, hopefully forcing the Union commander to weaken his hold on Vicksburg sufficiently enough, enabling Pemberton to cut his way out. Those attacks, of course, as we know, failed, and Pemberton would remain bottled up in Vicksburg. But Taylor even had the unique idea of hopefully moving into position here on DeSoto Point. And he had drafted up plans for the construction of catapults to catapult food supplies into the city of Vicksburg. But again, that never came about. Before we leave this site of the Shirley House, allow me to pass this around. This is perhaps the most famous photograph taken in the Vicksburg area during the course of the Civil War, showing what are called shebangs, or also known as dugouts, that the Union Army excavated down here in this ravine directly behind us. The purpose of these shebangs, or dugouts, was not only to shield themselves from Confederate artillery and musketry fire, but also to protect themselves against the hot sun of a Mississippi summer. You see the Shirley House, of course, is the prominent feature of this photograph. The Shirley House you see off to your right was constructed in the 1830s, known originally as Wexford Lodge. Wexford Lodge. In 1850, it is purchased by Judge James Shirley. Judge Shirley and his wife Adeline Quincy, a direct descendant of John Hancock, were Northerners, New Englanders to boot. Yet once they came to Mississippi, they actually became slave owners. The Shirleys, however, were very much outspoken in their support of the Union. And at the outbreak of the Civil War, due to their ardent support of the old flag, they were pretty much ostracized out here on their county estate. Bless you again. On May the 18th, as the Union Army approached Vicksburg, the judge was not at home. Rather, he was over in Clinton getting his daughter from school, trying to get her out of the way of the invading army. And so Adeline, her youngest son Quincy, and several house servants were caught in the building in the crossfire between Union and Confederate forces. They hid in a chimney corner for protection, and fortunately Mrs. Shirley had enough wits about her to send one of their servants with a white rag and displayed it from the end of a broomstick on the upstairs balcony. Well, they remained in the building for several days, caught in this crossfire as cannonball and bullets whizzed over their heads and riddled their house. Finally, under a flag of truce, Mrs. Shirley and Quincy and the house servants were removed to a cave excavated for them down here in this ravine. Union soldiers then began to plunder the house, but when they realized that she was an ardent Unionist, they stopped and tried to salvage what furniture and household belongings they could for benefit of the family. Now, the Shirleys were later joined in that cave by the judge, who returned on foot from Clinton. For their own protection, they were moved farther to the rear into an old slave cabin. But due to their outspoken support for the Union, they offered intelligence, if you will, to General Grant. They told him about the location of Confederate fortifications, troop disposition, artillery locations, supply and ammunition dumps, and so on, and they became fast friends with General Grant. So much so that Grant allowed their youngest son Quincy, then only 14, to shoulder a weapon and fight in the trenches for his country. And Grant promised that he would secure for the boy an appointment to West Point as soon as the siege was over. Well, true to his word, when the siege was over, Grant and his wife Julia took young Quincy in hand back to St. Louis, where they enrolled him in a preparatory school for West Point. He got the appointment to the academy, but flunked out his first year. He went back and got additional education, returned to the Point, only to flunk out a second time. And unfortunately for Quincy, he died shortly thereafter at a very young age. In fact, even after the siege was over, Grant appointed Judge Shirley as the mayor of the city of Vicksburg. But the judge didn't live long either. He died in August of 1863, and today Judge Shirley and his wife Adeline are interred behind the house. I'll pass this photograph around for those of you who want to take a look at it. The building, as you can see, is in dilapidated condition. It was purchased by the federal government in 1902 under the stipulation that it be restored and once again be the most conspicuous structure on the battlefield. True to that stipulation, the War Department restored this building. It became the park office for a period of time and even the residence of the park superintendent. But by 1960 it was abandoned by the Park Service as a residence, and if something is not occupied, it is just not properly maintained. With budget deficits throughout the decades of the 60s and 70s and 80s, this house has become so dilapidated now that even on a windy day you can stand here and just see the building swaying in the breeze. We're fearful that it's going to collapse in on itself, but we have finally completed the last required study for restoration of the building. We do have a $250,000 appropriation from the Congress for emergency stabilization of this building. Once all these reports are completed, we will then go back before the Congress in hopes of gaining a suitable appropriation for full-blown restoration of this building with the intent of opening this structure to the public once again. So hopefully over the next several years, sometime within the next couple of years, you folks will be able to come back here to Vicksburg and actually gain access to this building. Rob, if I may.
Terry,
we talked, yes ma'am.
Is there any furniture or memorabilia?
Is there any furniture in there? None whatsoever.
Not there, but that people have that.
None whatsoever. What happened after the war, the original furnishings, what was not destroyed by the Union Army, was moved by the Shirley family into storage over in Madison County, which is a neighboring county to the northeast. Unfortunately, sometime in the 1870s or 1880s, that barn caught on fire and destroyed much of the original furnishings of this building. What was salvaged was moved into another storage facility in Madison County. That too caught on fire several years later and destroyed the last remaining original furnishings of the Shirley House. Okay. Now we talked about approach operations, and what we're going to do here now, folks, is actually follow along the line of Logan's approach, and let me show you here. It begins directly behind us here where you see that upright blue tablet. That's the head of Logan's approach. We're going to follow Logan's approach as it zigzags back and forth along the Jackson Road all the way to the 3rd Louisiana Redan, 400 yards distance. And we'll follow each and every zig and zag and talk about engineering operations here at Vicksburg. Let me pass this around as well for you folks and you take a look at what we're going to do here. I've highlighted on there, I put in there the Illinois monument just to give you a point of reference. So many people come and say, boy, they had a nice thing to hide behind, didn't they? It's like when I worked up at Gettysburg, somebody asked me, do you take the monuments in during the winter? That's right. You know, when I worked at Gettysburg as a licensed guide, I used to tell folks all the time that the majority of these monuments were placed by the veterans themselves. And this one woman looked at me and said, you mean they carry these monuments into battle with them?
Okay.
Having finally decided to lay siege to the city, Grant would entrust his engineering officers with the responsibility for excavating these saps, these approaches. Here along the Jackson Road, the chief engineer of the 17th Army Corps, Captain Andy Hickenlooper, is entrusted by his superiors with the fatigue party and the responsibility for opening up this sap and excavating it all the way to the 3rd Louisiana Redan, 400 yards in our front. General John Logan, the division commander whose troops were astride this road, would detail a 300-man working party under Captain Hickenlooper's supervision. Armed with axe and saw, pick and shovel, these 300 men would report to Hickenlooper on the morning of May the 26th. Working in shifts of 100 men each around the clock, they would open up this sap right where you see that blue tablet across the road. Now, during approach operations, you never want to present your front to the enemy. You never want to dig a straight line because their artillery then could shoot, or muskets could shoot straight down that line. And so you're constantly zigzagging back and forth and tossing the dirt out on the side closest to the enemy for additional protection from enemy sharpshooters. And so the line begins over here and digs its way straight towards the Shirley House where you see the next tablet behind us over here. This will be the first angle in Logan's approach. Now they are excavating this sap. It is 7 feet deep, 8 feet wide. 7 feet deep that will enable the average man of the time period to stand fully erect and not be exposed to enemy fire. It is 8 feet wide that will enable the forward passage of a column of troops, 4 men abreast. It will also enable the forward passage of wagons and artillery. So if you follow me, we'll follow along Logan's approach. Now bear in mind that this starts on May the 26th of 1863. Temperatures in late May normally are in the mid to upper 80s, corresponding humidity. Now at 400 yards distance, there's not a great deal of fear from enemy sharpshooters to our front. After all, the average infantryman during the Civil War is more or less wasting his shot beyond 300 yards. But with each inch we move forward, sharpshooting activity increases dramatically. Now this soil is known as lowest soil. This is a wind-blown sediment. They came in here eons ago from what is today Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. There are no rocks in the soil. It's a fine, filthy clay that if you looked at it under a magnifying glass, it would look like a bunch of pickup sticks all twisted together. It has the amazing capacity to take a vertical cut and remain vertical indefinitely. And it needs no shoring whatsoever to retain its form. But once erosion starts, erosion takes off like wildfire. And so by all accounts, the Union soldiers with pick and shovel are able to excavate rather readily here at Vicksburg. So they're excavating this sap, 7 feet deep, 8 feet wide. These men are working behind the protection of what's called a sap roller. Now a sap roller, shown here, is normally a bundle of cane and vine woven together, packed with dirt or cotton, anything that'll stop a bullet. And behind it are your fatigue men with the pick and shovel excavating the approach. Well, here along the Jackson Road, the Union forces are utilizing a rather unique sap roller. Rather than this bundle of cane that you see on that diagram, they actually have secured a railroad flat car from the Southern Railroad of Mississippi, took off the metal wheels and inserted wooden wheel, and on top of this flat car piled 20 to 30 bales of cotton, and they put headlogs, loopholes for sharpshooters on it, and they pushed this mobile firing platform by hand in front of the digging party. Now you can imagine trying to push this railroad flat car over this terrain, but they pushed this in front of the fatigued party, and on May the 26th are making rapid progress from the head of the approach past the Shirley House and working their way toward where we now are. Now you know where we're now standing, which is actually a part of the original roadway up to the Shirley House from the Jackson Road. The Union forces incorporated that into their approach. You note in the distance where the group of students is standing with red shirts, that's the Confederate line. That's the road cut through which the Jackson Road passes through the Confederate defense perimeter. You note the red tablets and the artillery pieces as well, and they're aimed straight at us. You recall I said you never want to present your front to the enemy in approach operations. As a result, when they get to this point, Captain Hickenlooper detours the fatigue party to your right.
So you used them on you for sure, right?
That's right.
The Confederates didn't want to damage us, so they didn't fire it with their artillery.
Was it hard to dig in this hole?
They were
Well, according to the Union soldiers, it wasn't so bad. Now, where I live, which is about 7 miles east of here, I'm moving out of the lowest and into more of a clay. I must say, if I go to dig a hole in my yard to plant an azalea bush or a tree or something, it is a tremendous physical workout. Now, at this point, we can't go any farther forward due to this now densely wooded ravine. As a result, we come to another angle in the approach and must go in this direction. You recall that you are working to construct the sap 7 feet deep, 8 feet wide. You're tossing the dirt out to your left to form greater protection against enemy sharpshooters. We are now about 300 yards from the Confederate fortifications, so sharpshooting activity is starting to pick up considerably at this stage of the operation.
How fast are they doing this?
Well, the sap begins on May the 26th. By day's end, that very first day, they are right here.
Oh my
They are
goodness.
right here.
So we didn't know this was recorded.
Dirt.
I've never done the math.
Cubic bags
That's
of
right.
dirt.
Are they
You
in
have
blue
a-
uniforms?
Oh yes, ma'am, they're in uniform. I'm sure that they didn't have their coats on. But here you have a 300-man fatigue party working round the clock. So with 300 men working in a 24-hour period, you can move an awful lot of dirt. And this is where the sap would reach at the end of the very first day of digging. Now, on the first night of digging, Captain Hickenlooper will make a reassessment of the situation. He can't go straight any longer because you see the now densely wooded ravine in our front. That particular ravine ends at the Confederate fortifications. It's a very deep, very steep, and very wide ravine. He can't go any farther forward. He certainly doesn't want to go off to the right because that's taking you farther and farther away from your objective. The only place to take this approach from here is off to your left, back toward the Jackson Road. Now, as you work in that direction, what are you going to be doing?
Exposing more.
You're presenting your flank and possibly your rear to the enemy across the way, who, under cover of darkness, as all the trees are pointing in the other direction, could easily filter through that obstruction with a sortie and capture your fatigue party.
Terry, there's no trees here at that time.
No trees at all. These are all cut.
Cleared.
You have a clear, unobstructed view between the opposing lines. What trees were here were cut by the Confederates to construct lines of fortification and this obstruction of felled
Totally out
trees.
in the open at this point.
They are out in the open, sure are. As a result, to provide protection for his fatigue parties, Captain Hickenlooper that night, on the 26th, morning of May 22nd, will bring up 2 guns of the 1st Minnesota Battery and place them in position here. With the rising sun on May the 27th, these guns roar into action. With this protection afforded his fatigue parties, Hickenlooper feels confident with the situation, and so he resumes the digging off to your left. And so let's follow along. Now, the whole time the Federal fatigue parties are working in this area, they are tossing the dirt now out to your right. They are also bringing up wooden planks for firing steps. They are bringing up headlogs, loophole for sharpshooters, and they are placing a sharpshooter every 3 feet, armed with 60 rounds of munitions per man, with instructions to fire all 60 rounds during the course of that day. Keep up such a steady sharpshooting fire that you pin the Confederates to their work and provide adequate protection to the Union fatigue parties. Yes, sir.
Why aren't the Confederates sighting some artillery pieces on this and blasting away?
Why aren't
at
the
it?
Confederates sighting artillery pieces? It's a good question. First of all, due to siege operations, not knowing how long this siege might last, John Pemberton is trying to conserve munitions. And so he has issued instructions for his chief of artillery to ensure that his gun crews do not fire unless they are under direct orders to do so or under direct assault. He must begin husbanding valuable resources that are limited in quantity. Now, as we're moving along this line, we're now within 300 yards of the Confederate fortifications. There's a clear, unobstructed view to the Confederate works, and they are slightly on higher ground than we are. As a result, sharpshooting activity intensifies in this area. With sharpshooting intensifying and bullets whizzing around your head, what do you think this fatigue party is doing? They're ducking down a little bit lower, aren't they? Tossing this dirt out. My point is, fearful of the Confederate sharpshooters, work slows tremendously. You recall the distance we covered in the very first day of digging. Well, it will take 2 days to go from where those cannon are out to the Jackson Road. And look how much shorter of a distance we're talking about. It will take 2 days to reach the Jackson Road, but the fatigue party will reach the Jackson Road on May the 29th, 1863. Very pleased with the forward progress thus far made by his fatigue parties, Andy Hickenlooper, the captain of engineers in charge of this operation, cuts the fatigue party down from 300 men to 200 men. But still the digging continues around the clock. Once we reach the Jackson Road, just watch out for the fence here, folks. It turns to your right, angling off to the west toward its objective once again. If you will follow me up the hillside here, just be mindful of your step. It may be a little slippery.
Oh, sure.
Robbie,
Taking these trees out of here?
we do.
When you guys think about when can you do that? Well, that's another project.
Believe you me, if it were up to me, they'd be gone today. But you have to go through the review and compliance processes. The environmental community, as you might imagine, is opposed to cutting down a single tree. After all, this is a national park. And so it's honestly going to take us probably 5 to 10 years to go through the review process, hold the required public meetings, have scoping documents drafted, and so on. It's just the nature of the federal bureaucracy. Recall, although you folks here are vastly interested in the Civil War, and that is what this park was established to commemorate, there are other interests in America that are equally as powerful and active as the Civil War community, and they are opposed to us cutting down any trees at all. But we have been successful thus far in clearing one 14-acre tract. We do have the review and compliance documentation in place, going through the approval process right now to clear an additional 3 acres. But the idea is to fill out the document rather than do this piecemeal. The idea that we're following right now is to do the review and compliance documentation for the entire proposed vista clearing operation, which is to remove all the trees between Union and Confederate avenues and restore this field to its wartime appearance. To do so will require us to do environmental impact statements. Estimated cost for just producing that document alone, $250,000, which we certainly don't have in our budget. That will take a line item appropriation from the Congress. And so it's going to be a very long and involved, it's going to be a very difficult process, but we're determined to persevere and win out. Okay. The reason I stop here, folks, as the Union Army is digging this approach and inching its way toward the 3rd Louisiana Redan, you recall they're posting sharpshooters along this approach, armed with 60 rounds of munitions per man, with instructions to fire all 60 rounds each and every day to keep the Confederates pinned to their work and to protect this fatigue party. Well, operating in this area of the siege lines was the 23rd Indiana Volunteers, which boasted of the best shot in the Union Army, a lieutenant by the name of Henry Foster. Now Foster, anxious to enhance his reputation and embellish his trade, followed along in the wake of the fatigue party, searching for a favorable spot from which to conduct sharpshooting activities. As curious soldiers are wont to do, as he began following along this approach, he spied the Shirley House and went inside looking for souvenirs. And he found lying on the floor in the central hallway Quincy Shirley's most prized possession, a coonskin cap. And so he picked it up and put it on. It fit rather nicely, and so he adopted it as his standard headgear for the duration of siege operations. And with such distinctive headgear, it's easy to understand why he was dubbed by his comrades as Coonskin Foster. Well, Coonskin followed along in the wake of the fatigue parties to this very point. And across the street where that stone now stands, he actually burrowed underground and poked a hole out to the surface. And through this small opening had a clear view straight down the road to the 3rd Louisiana Redan. After 3 days, however, in this underground concealment, his munitions were expended, his rations exhausted. Besides, it was dark, it was cramped, it was uncomfortable, and rattlesnakes had a tendency to crawl in for the shade. As a result, he decided to abandon his burrow, but as he looked around, he could find no spot more advantageous from which to continue his sharpshooting operations. But being a very enterprising soldier, he devised a unique idea. He went down to the Southern Railroad of Mississippi with several members of the 23rd Indiana, shouldered a number of railroad ties, brought them to this location, and under cover of darkness built himself a tower.
Oh my God.
Now the tower was anywhere from 12 to 15 feet high. At the top of this tower, and I'll pass that around, Don. At the top of this tower he placed a mirror at a slight angle. And what he did was hide behind this wall of thick railroad ties, crouched down all day long just looking up at this mirror. And the second any Confederate soldier came into view in the mirror, he'd stand, turn, fire, and then duck back down. Now the Confederates who returned the fire, their mini balls were either embedded harmlessly in these thick railroad ties or flew harmlessly around the tower. When Confederate artillery roared into action in an attempt to destroy the tower, Confederate guns were quickly smothered by more numerous and more powerful Federal cannon, such as those we saw down at Battery de Gallier. And so this tower stood for the duration of the siege and was a rather novel thing on the field of battle, so close to the front. So novel was it that many curious soldiers in their free time came here to the Jackson Road and asked permission of Henry Foster to go up his tower. So many, in fact, that he started charging 25 cents admission for curious soldiers to climb the tower. And so not only did he enhance his reputation as a sharpshooter, but he also added quite nicely to his army pay. But one of the more frequent visitors to this tower was no less an individual than Major General Ulysses S. Grant, the Army commander. Now, as most of you know, Grant had the habit of going along the siege lines dressed in the uniform of a common private so as not to draw attention to himself, the only sign of rank being the 2 stars that he wore on his shoulders. Well, one day Grant was up this tower, foolishly exposing himself by standing fully erect and looking out with his binoculars in hand. Seeing this Union soldier being so foolish, a Confederate across the way felt pity for him and started yelling obscenities at him, telling him in essence to get his head down or get it shot off. Mind you, however, he used very colorful language. A Confederate captain, hearing these oaths, looked across the way to see at whom they were directed, and he recognized the person of General Grant. Rather than tell this soldier to shut up and shoot, he reprimanded him for using offensive language with an officer, even if that officer was the enemy's officer. Well, Grant, hearing this commotion, realized the danger he was in and climbed on out of the tower and was spared to go on to Appomattox and eventually to the White House. Let's continue on, folks.
Did he have to pay a quarter?
The record doesn't say.
I highly doubt it. Let me just borrow his shoulder straps for a couple of days. That'd be enough pay.
Get to that area a little later today. How are we doing on time-wise, folks?
10:30.
Oh, 10:30, that's not too bad. Want to make sure I get us to the restaurant in time since they're waiting for us here. Do you recall that on May the 25th, there was a truce to remove the wounded and bury the dead? During that truce, engineering officer Hickenlooper actually walked out here into what was then no man's land, and he took very careful mental measurements of the terrain features of the area and the topography in preparation for laying out his line of approach. He spotted this particular knoll and selected it for the placement of what became known as the Advanced Breaching Battery. You see the guns of the Advanced Breaching Battery before you. The Union Fatigue Party reaches this area on June the 3rd, and beginning on June the 3rd, they began leveling this hilltop, throwing up a parapet, bringing up wood for firing platforms, and hauling the cannon into place. On June the 5th, everything is in readiness, and these big guns open fire on June the 5th. And you can imagine the effectiveness of these big guns at such close range against earthen fortifications. They just pulverize the Confederate works, weakening those Confederate fortifications with each and every shot. In a desperate effort to maintain the integrity of their fortifications, the Confederates, under cover of darkness, will throw out fatigue parties to try to fill in those holes and pack the dirt down, but I can assure you that the Union artillery created holes a lot faster than the Confederates could fill them in. Thus, beginning on June the 5th, we see a rapid deterioration in the strength of the Confederate fortifications. With this advanced breaching battery now in operation, Hickenlooper gives the forward order to his fatigue parties. Thus, on June the 5th, you can imagine the consternation of the Confederates across the way, seeing this railroad flat car piled high with cotton bales work its way around the north end of this battery and continue to inch its way forward. Done. Otherwise, the Federals will be on top of them within just a few more days. The Confederates fire at this sap roller, but their mini balls do absolutely no damage to it, Anytime they open with artillery, the Confederate cannon are quickly smothered by Union guns, now those of the advanced breaching battery. They're almost helpless. But one enterprising Confederate soldier comes up with a novel idea. He suggests that they take cotton cloth, soak it in turpentine, wrap it around the base of the mini balls, and by using a reduced powder charge, fire these rounds directly into the cotton bales. By utilizing a reduced powder charge, it'll go into the cotton bales but not out the other side. And then once the gun is discharged, the flame that engulfs the round sets that tallow on fire. And so you're actually using fire bullets, if you will, and pump several rounds into these cotton bales. Well, in just a short period of time, suddenly the cotton bales begin to smolder. Then they burst into flame, and in a matter of moments, this railroad flat car is completely consumed. The fatigue party is exposed and runs for cover. All work on this forward approach comes to a grinding halt. But it doesn't take the Union Army very long to construct more traditional sap rollers, those that I showed you the illustration of, those bundles of cane and vine packed together, filled with dirt or cotton, anything that'll stop a bullet, and the forward progress resumes. As they do so, they're tossing the dirt up, they're bringing up headlogs, loophole for sharpshooters, and that's what all these monuments here say, sharpshooters line, and you can follow them because they give the exact dates, and so you can see how the Union Army is inching its way closer and closer and closer to the Confederate fortifications in front of us here. As mentioned, this work is being done under the supervision of the Chief Engineer of the 17th Army Corps, Captain Andrew Hickenlooper. You see a beautiful standing statue of Hickenlooper now coming into view. This was a gift given to the park by Captain Hickenlooper's family.
Did the Confederates, did they use Gibbons, you know,
Oh, gabions?
Gabions.
There are, the federal soldiers actually bringing up some gabions just to be on the safe side and using them for shoring, which is not necessary at all. The Confederates do have some gabions in their work trying to minimize the effectiveness of Union sharpshooters and limit also the scatter of Union projectiles. Okay. But here you see Captain Hickenlooper. By June the 16th, the digging parties have reached this very point. We're now near the point of the 3rd Louisiana Redan. Again, you'll recall this is a triangular shaped fortification, the apex facing the enemy. Having reached the point of the 3rd Louisiana Redan, Hickenlooper is somewhat reluctant to continue a forward motion because off here to your left front, you'll note a relatively low, flat area. He's afraid that under cover of darkness, the Confederates will conduct a sortie out from their works and capture his fatigue parties. Thus, before he gives them the orders to resume the forward progress, he wants to provide adequate protection for the fatigue party and orders a side trench excavated here to your left front. And just follow the line of those monuments and you get a pretty good idea of where that lateral trench was. Now, many people, including some of the trained military officers who come here, often remark, well, isn't that a bad place for sharpshooters? Not actually. You're down low in this location. The enemy up on the high ground where you see the red tablets, cannon, and monuments. For these Confederates to get a shot at these guys down here in this trench, what do they have to do? They have to stand up on their tippy toes, stretch out a little bit farther over the parapets to get a good view of these Union soldiers. As they do so, especially in the afternoon, they're silhouetted against the sky and are easy targets for these Union sharpshooters down here in this lateral trench. Once this lateral trench has been completed, Hickenlooper gives the order to resume the forward approach. A variety of reasons the Confederates stay pinned to their works. Besides, by this time period of the siege, these guys are on greatly reduced rations. Their physical abilities have been greatly diminished. They have been greatly demoralized by the duration of the siege and the defeats out in the field. They have yielded the initiative in its entirety to General Grant and his Union forces. You're leaning up against the sign. That's all right, though. But that's right at the point.
Holding it up for a minute.
It's right at the point of the 3rd Louisiana Redan. You recall that the 3rd Louisiana Redan, an earthen fortification in the form of a triangle, the apex facing the enemy. Its walls are 26 feet thick, 18 feet high. Union soldiers have no scaling ladders with them at this point. But on, let's see, which day is it? June 21st? That's right, 25th, they reached this area here. No, 25th is the mining explosion. On the 22nd, they reached this area, which is the point of the Redan, and immediately the digging parties disappear below the surface of the ground, excavating a gallery, or a tunnel, if you will, 40 feet in, directly beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan. Fortunately for Captain Hickenlooper, operating in this area were troops from Illinois that prior to the war were primarily lead miners. Used to working in these dark, dank, cramped conditions, these lead miners armed with pick and shovel were put to work excavating this gallery. The gallery measured only 3 feet by 4 feet. Can you imagine working in such cramped conditions underground, the only illumination coming from a candle? Well, this fatigue party would inch its way very slowly directly beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan. The Confederates, aware of what is going on, attempt to sink counter shafts from within their own works. These counter shafts would go straight down 10, 15, 20 feet. By all accounts, at the bottom of the counter shafts, the air was stifling. It was almost impossible to breathe. But at the bottom of the counter shafts, you could actually make out the sounds of Union soldiers digging opposite you. You could even make out their conversations. But sounds travel differently below ground than they do on the surface. And although they could plainly hear the Union soldiers even talking, they could not tell from what direction or from what distance those sounds were coming. All they knew that was on the 25th day of June, the digging opposite them stopped. It meant one thing: the mine had been completed. Sure enough, on June the 25th, this gallery sunk 40 feet beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan. At the end of this gallery, lateral tunnels were also excavated at different angles. The mine had been completed and Grant was notified of that result. Grant ordered the mine planted immediately. 2,200 pounds of black powder would be carried forward in 25-pound sacks by Union volunteers all the way along this forward approach we have just followed here to the gallery beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan, and the mine would be packed. Fuses were borrowed by the United States from the U.S. Navy, and the time for detonation was set at 3:30 that afternoon. I'm sorry, 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock that afternoon. Grant ordered his troops all along this broad front to prepare for battle, and as soon as the mine was detonated, to open up a tremendous fire along the line against the Confederates, simply trying to keep them pinned to their works, prevent them from detaching troops from one sector of the line and sending them here to where hopefully the penetration would be made. And among the 17th Corps, the Union troops are already lined up for battle in a densely packed column all the way down this forward approach. The fuses are lit, but 3 o'clock comes and goes. No explosion. 3:05, 3:10, 3:15, still nothing, and Grant is waiting anxiously at the advanced breaching battery to see the explosion. 3:20, 3:25, still nothing. Obviously something had gone wrong, and you can imagine the consternation of these volunteers up at the head of this column, wondering when somebody was going to be sent in to find out what happened. Well, they decided to give it a few more minutes. 3:26, 3:27, still nothing. But suddenly at 3:28 in the afternoon of June 25th, 1863, there came a muffled thud. Then a loud explosion as the dirt in this area began to break, and in a column of flame and dirt you could actually see men and mules, wagons, artillery pieces blown skyward. Before the dust even settled, down the Jackson Road came this densely packed column, 4 men abreast, their bayonets just glistening in the sunlight through the dust. Into the crater they poured. The crater itself measured more than 30 feet across, 15 feet deep. Many Union soldiers pouring into this crater gawked at the destructive force of this explosion. My point is, they delayed, they hesitated just a few moments. Many, in fact, even stopped to pull Confederate soldiers out of the debris who had been buried alive. But this period of hesitation allowed the Confederates, who realized that something was about to transpire on this front and had massed reinforcements of their own behind us here, surged those reinforcements forward. With the rebel yell ringing in the air, these Confederates slammed into the Federals and at the point of bayonet contained their advance and slowly, ever so slowly, drove them back into the crater itself, where the battle continued to rage in unabated fury for 26 hours as Grant sent in one fresh regiment after another, trying to punch his way through the Confederate lines. By some accounts, the crater itself slowly filled with the bodies of the dead and wounded, men in blue and gray, until it was almost completely filled. But finally, late the next day, Grant realized his great gamble had failed, and he called his troops back to minimize his casualties. Undaunted by the failure of this explosion on June 25th to result in a capitulation of Vicksburg, Captain Andy Hickenlooper resumed tunneling operations and would excavate yet another gallery under what remained of the 3rd Louisiana Redan. Now, prior to the first explosion, knowing that the Federals were digging directly beneath this fort, the Confederates had constructed a gorge wall, if you will, and you see the gorge wall right here across the gorge or the base of this triangle. And they pulled most of their troops back to this position. Thus, Confederate casualties were actually minimized during this first explosion. But here Hickenlooper resumes tunneling operations to dig a tunnel directly underneath this gorge wall with the object of planting yet a second mine and destroy this fortification. The Confederates called on Major Sam Lockett to see what he recommended. Lockett recommended they simply throw a thunder keg down on top of the Federals. And what a thunder keg is simply a wooden barrel of gunpowder, 500 pounds worth, that you light a fuse, just roll it over your works, and it goes off, hopefully pulverizing this dirt. Now, you recall this loess soil will maintain its shape, even digging into it, and it needs no shoring. But you cannot dig into pulverized dirt. But the thunder keg goes off with a tremendous bang. It has absolutely no effect whatsoever on the Union gallery. Thus, almost at wit's end, Lockett simply suggests they once again resume counter-mining operations. Now, the Confederates had lost several white soldiers in this first counter-mining operation when the mine exploded. Not wishing to lose additional, irreplaceable white soldiers, 7 blacks under the command of a Confederate corporal were placed down in these counter shafts and were busy digging away when on July 1st a second mine was detonated. This mine a little bit smaller, only 1,800 pounds of powder. 6 of these blacks were buried alive, but one, a slave named Abraham, was actually blown skyward and landed behind Union lines. Now you can imagine these Union soldiers under arms waiting for this explosion to take place and the order to charge be given, seeing this black man falling out of the sky behind him. Well, by all accounts, this poor man landed on his head, yet he was completely unscathed, not a scratch on him. Some Union soldiers ran up to this man, picked him up, dusted him off. Even one had the audacity to ask him, "How high'd you go?" To which this black man responded, "Don't rightly know, massa, but think 3 miles. He responded to another inquiry, "I passed massa on the way up, and I passed massa on the way down." Well, this fellow was an instant celebrity. He was actually taken back and introduced to General Grant and General McPherson. McPherson was so enamored by this man and his story that he took him on as his personal cook. And he remained McPherson's cook until McPherson's death in front of Atlanta in 1864. But some enterprising soldiers in the remaining days of the siege actually sequestered this man in a tent and charged 50 cents admission for curious soldiers just to gawk at the man who was blown to freedom. Well, on July the 1st, this explosion was not followed up by an infantry assault. Grant had learned his lesson the first go-around. On July the 1st, Grant was notified by his subordinate officers that given just a few more days of digging, all 13 approaches would be completed, at which time 13 mines could be planted and detonated simultaneously along the Confederate defense perimeter. This was the moment that Grant and his army had been working for all these many weeks of siege. And let there be no doubt in your mind that had such an event taken place, Vicksburg would have fallen by force of arms like that. But Grant is in preparation of planning an attack he schedules for July the 6th, when on July the 3rd, suddenly white flags of truce appear along the city's fortifications. On the 46th day of siege, General John Pemberton will ride out from the city beyond the Confederate works, and under a flag of truce he will ask Grant on what terms he would receive the surrender of the city and garrison under his command, to which Grant replied he had no terms other than an immediate and unconditional surrender of the city. These terms were unacceptable to Pemberton, who shook his finger at Grant's face and said, "General, I can assure you, you'll bury many more of your men then before you ever enter the fortress city of Vicksburg." You see, Pemberton is a northerner by birth, you recall, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Prior to riding out to meet Grant, he conferred with some of his subordinate officers to get an idea of the condition of the troops and their ability to possibly conduct breakout operations. His subordinates informed him that the men were in such weakened condition physically that they could not undergo the hardships involved in a breakout attempt. With no recourse left him, Pemberton rode out to meet Grant. He said, "I know my people," meaning the Northerners. He said they are a vain, glorious, and egotistical lot. They will give anything if this city is to surrender on the great national holiday of July the 4th. And so with that in mind, Pemberton will open communications with Grant. But when Grant says he has no terms other than an immediate and unconditional surrender, Pemberton's bluff has been called. As a result, the two generals will come to no agreement other than a cessation of hostilities and agree on a continuation of an exchange of notes until agreeable terms could be worked out. Pemberton would return to his headquarters on Crawford Street. There he would assemble his subordinate officers and talk to them about the surrender. Grant would finally send in his final amended terms. These terms are amended based on the recommendation of Admiral Porter, because you see, as Grant returns to his headquarters, he immediately opens up communication with Admiral Porter in the river and asks the Admiral if he had enough riverborne transportation to escort the garrison of Vicksburg and all its munitions northward to prison. Porter said he did not. Besides, he says, "Grant, your army could be put to better use other than guarding prisoners and escorting them northward." Porter recommended to Grant that he simply parole the garrison. The idea sounded appealing to Grant, and so at 10 o'clock that night, he sent in his final amended terms. Rather than call for an immediate and unconditional surrender of the city, he offered terms of parole to Pemberton. Now, what is a parole? Many of you will recall that during the course of the Civil War, there was a system of prisoner exchange called the Dix Hill Cartel. Under the terms of the Dix Hill Cartel, you could parole prisoners. And what that is these prisoners would simply sign a document, making an oath, if you will, promising not to take up arms against the federal government until an equal number of Union soldiers, man for man, rank for rank, are released from prison or freed from their paroles. This Dix Hill Cartel even established a ratio, if you will, where a general officer was the equivalent of 40 privates. And there were an awful lot of privates who disagreed with that assessment. But these terms were agreeable to Pemberton. And so in the pre-dawn darkness of July the 4th, he sent a note back to Grant via courier saying that his terms were accepted. Thus at 10 o'clock in the morning, now July the 4th, white flags of truce appeared along the lines once again. Marching out from the city that they had defended so long and so valiantly were the men in gray, who here in front of their work stacked their arms, furled their flags, turned over their accoutrements, and a victorious Union army marched in and took possession of the fortress city of Vicksburg. On July the 4th, Grant himself would ride in along this very road off to the side here known as the Jackson Road, go down to the Warren County Courthouse, watch as the stars and bars of the Confederacy were lowered to be replaced by the stars and stripes symbolic of Union victory. He then rode down to the waterfront to personally thank and congratulate Admiral David Dixon Porter for the services rendered by the United States Navy, and Grant would be the first to admit he could never have captured Vicksburg without the assistance of the United States Navy. Almost as an afterthought, Grant would send a message to President Abraham Lincoln informing the Commander-in-Chief that Vicksburg had fallen. It would take several days for this message to reach Washington. In the interim, the Great Battle of Gettysburg is fought on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and in the interim, the only remaining Confederate bastion on the Mississippi River, Port Hudson, Louisiana, falls to General Nathaniel Banks. Thus, when Grant's note reaches the President in the quiet of his office in the White House, he simply sighed, "Thank God, the Father of waters again flows unvexed to the sea." Although the Mississippi River was now in federal hands, the Southern Confederacy cut in two. Now wrapped in the coils of the giant anaconda, the South would slowly be strangled into submission. But the war itself would last for yet another 18 months. But ultimately, the Union itself would be preserved. Any questions at this point you folks would like to ask?
Terry?
Ma'am.
Yeah, you mentioned McClernand had sent a message to Grant
Uh-huh.
saying he had captured 2 forts. Did he actually capture these forts?
If I may answer that question after lunch this
Okay.
afternoon, we'll be
Yes,
getting to that
okay.
very point, and we'll talk about McClernand's operations at Vicksburg, okay? Yes, ma'am.
In view of the fact that single charges failed here for the freighters,
Mhm.
why did Grant okay one freighter at Petersburg?
Well, that's a very